For level 4, the only difference that we're going to introduce here is now having an A value. But the process that we've been using for level 2 and 3 is going to remain the same throughout level 4. So when we are given a exponential function to graph, we need to automatically put -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2 into my table. And we are going to plug those values in for x. Now here is where a calculator really will get to be very helpful for you. So if you don't have one, I really encourage you to try to locate one to use. You do have one available on your computer, but this is the best method to use. And I believe they're like between 10 and 20 bucks at Target or Walmart or Amazon. I'm happy to find the link and send it to you or send it to your parents so that you can make sure that you get one that would be useful in our class. So when we enter this into our calculator, we want to enter in a fraction first. So we're going to press n over d, and we'll enter in 1/2, 1 over 2, and then we need to exit that fraction. And we are multiplying that by the next fraction. So fraction 3 over 2, and exit that fraction. And this is the fraction that we are going to raise to our exponent. So we press the caret button, looks like the top of a TP, and then we will type in our -2. And it spits it out as a fraction. We can change that back from a fraction to a decimal by pressing second and then the table button. No need to press them at the same time. It won't be able to pick it up like that. It's not like using the shift button on your computer. It spits out 0.2 repeating. So 0.2, and we'll put our repeating symbol above it. And you don't have to retype the equation every single time if you're using one of these calculators. You can just press the up button until you have highlighted the equation again. So there's our equation. We'll change that -2 to a -1 and change it back to a decimal. Highlight that equation again. And we're going to change that -1 to 0. So when I just type 0, it just gets rid of the negative, so we do have to use the delete button. And we get 1/2, which you should know that as a decimal, but in case you don't, you have a calculator that will help you out. And again, we're going to highlight and press enter, and we'll change that 0 this time to a 1. And change it to a decimal. Highlight our new equation. Whoops, I forgot to change my 1 to a 2. And change it to a decimal. Once you have your table, we're going to plot our asymptote. Remember, our asymptote for this class is at y equals 0. Dashed line all the way down the x-axis. And then we're going to plot these points. They're all going to be fairly close to the axis here. So we have one at -2.22, -2, 3.3, or sorry, -1, 3.3, 0, and 0.5, 1 and 0.75, and then 2 and 1.125. You can see that ever so slightly it's getting bigger, which would make sense because we have growth functions that get bigger from left to right, and decay functions get smaller from left to right. And we look at this b value here. This b value tells me that it is growth because 3/2 is which is bigger than 1. So when I draw my line, I want to be very careful to make sure that I don't touch or cross. And then continue up. Number 2. Automatically, we want to do -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. And we'll type into our calculator. -2 times n over d 4 over 3. And then if you just close the parenthesis without exiting, it'll do the same thing as if you just do an exponent without exiting. And that's not what we want. So make sure always that you exit your fraction before you continue. So close the parenthesis, and we're raising it to the -2 first. And change it to our decimal. So we get -1.125. Press up again until you highlight your function. We're going to change that -2 to -1 and change it to a decimal. Highlight your equation again. Change that -1 to 0. Highlight your equation again and change that 0 to 1. We need to change that to our decimal. We get -2.6 repeating. Change your 1 to a 2. We have -3.5 repeating. So let's go ahead and plot this onto our graph. We've got our asymptote to do first. Right along that x-axis. Then -2 and -1.125. -1, -1.5, 0 and -2, 1 and -2.6 repeating, 2 and -3.5, 5 repeating. So you can see it's now trending down. Now that we have our dots plotted, we're just going to draw our line. Careful to go along, but not actually touching or crossing the asymptote. Once again, please make sure that if your line is accidentally touching or crossing the asymptote and you're having trouble getting close to it but not actually touching or crossing it, just jot me a note next to it indicating that you know it's not supposed to touch or cross, but do your best to try to get it along but not touching or crossing. Now that this one's graphed, you can see that it goes down from left to right. And I know that we have talked about with decay, it goes down from left to right, and growth, it goes up from left to right. And you look at this and you're like, but this B value indicates that it is growth. Yes, it is still growth. The reason why it goes down from left to right is because of this negative here. This negative takes what was going up from left to right and reflects it down below the axis. So when it's below the axis, you cannot just look at it and decide whether it's growth or decay. Instead, you have to go back to that growth factor. Let's do 2 more. So automatically, we're filling in -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. And in our calculator, we will put 3 times 2 to the, and we'll put -2 in. And so you might already know what that one is as a decimal, but in case you don't, you press second and table. If you have a different calculator besides mine, just contact me and I will help you locate where all these buttons are on your calculator. Then we'll go and highlight our equation again, change that -2 to -1, and change it back into a decimal for 1.5. Repeat this process that we've been doing for our last two, changing that -1 to 0, and we get 3. Change the 0 to 1 for 6, and then finally change that 1 to 2. And we get 12. Now we're going to draw in our asymptote. So we have -2 and 0.75, -1, 1.5, 0 and 3, 1 and 6, and 212 doesn't fit, so we don't plot it. Our line is going to go along the asymptote, never touching or crossing. And there's our graph. Last one. So automatically, -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. So this time we've got to put a fraction into our calculator. So parenthesis, fraction 1 over 2. Exit your fraction and close your parenthesis. Then we're typing in, oops, sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see that very well. There you go. And then parenthesis 4, close parenthesis, raised to the, we'll put in -2. Change it back to a decimal. We get 0.03125. Change that -2 to a -1. 0.125. Highlight your equation and change that change the -1 to a 0, and we get 1/2, which you know is 0.5. Highlight your equation again and change that 0 to a 1. Highlight your equation and change the 1 to a 2. Our asymptote is still going to be at y = 0. Let's plot the points. So -2, 0.03, blah, 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 -1 and 0.125, 0 and 0.5. Just keep getting a hair higher every single time. 1 and 2, and then 2, all the way up to 8. So it's going along the axis, and then it shoots sharply up.